Ever feel like you're kind of navigating a maze, trying to get a handle on the fundamental nature of reality? That little nagging feeling, about what really lies beneath the surface of everything. Well, you're definitely in the right place today. We're plunging headfirst into metaphysics, really aiming to bring some clarity to what can be a pretty deep and, let's face it, sometimes confusing subject.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll be your guides, sort of as we explore these core ideas of metaphysics. It's that branch of philosophy, isn't it, that just grapples with the very essence of existence itself. We've gathered a whole range of sources, quite a mix actually, to help us on this journey.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at how this kind of thinking, well, took shape across different cultures
Hmm.
and what the really big questions are.
Right. We've got material that digs into the historical roots,
Good.
from ancient Greece all the way over to the philosophical traditions of India. And our mission, if you like, for this deep dive, it's really to pull out the most crucial, the most captivating bits, to make sense of concepts like being, essence, substance, and that timeless head scratcher, the problem of the one and the many.
That old chestnut.
Exactly. And we'll even be exploring some maybe surprising potential links to how modern science sees the world and, well, our ongoing search for ultimate reality. Okay, so to kick us off, where did this whole way of thinking, this field we call metaphysics, actually start?
Well, the story of the name itself, at least in the West, it's quite interesting. Traditionally, the term metaphysics gets attributed to Andronicus of Rhodes. This was back in the 1st century BC. He was putting Aristotle's writings together, and supposedly he just placed the books dealing with first philosophy, which is what we now call metaphysics, after the books on physics. So metaphysics literally meant after the physics.
Huh. So it was almost like just where they happen to end up on the shelf. It feels a little bit, I don't know, arbitrary for such a fundamental area of thought.
It does seem that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And some big names, like Immanuel Kant, for instance, were definitely skeptical. They didn't quite buy that accidental origin story. But there's this alternative view from Hans Reimer. He suggests it might actually have been Eudemus, one of Aristotle's own disciples.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Reimer thinks Eudemus might have coined the term for teaching purposes. The idea is Eudemus grouped these key texts on first philosophy, that was Plato's term, really maybe found first philosophy a bit too abstract for students. So he called the collection after physics, perhaps just as a practical label, and Andronicus later just adopted that existing name.
So maybe less accidental, more pedagogical then.
Possibly. It suggests a more deliberate choice anyway, rather than just the librarian's quirk. And over time, metaphysics definitely evolved to mean the study of things beyond the purely physical, the hyperphysical, the supersensible, the immaterial aspects of reality.
That's a fascinating development. So while the West was sort of formalizing this idea of metaphysics, what was happening in India? Were there similar concepts emerging there?
Absolutely. I mean, the specific word metaphysics is Western, but Indian philosophy has this incredibly rich vocabulary for tackling very similar fundamental questions about reality. One of the earliest terms we find, and this goes way back to the Vedic literature, maybe the 9th century BC, is Brahmoja.
Ramoji.
Yeah, it basically referred to these speculative, really deep discussions, specifically about Brahman, the ultimate reality in many Indian traditions. Think of it as early philosophical brainstorming about the ground of existence itself.
Right, like ancient deep dives. Were there other terms too?
Oh, yes. A few centuries later, in the Upanishads, you get terms like Atmavidya, that's like the science or knowledge of the self, the Atman. Then there's Payavidya, which means supreme or transcendental knowledge, the stuff beyond the everyday. And Brahmavidya, again, the science or knowledge of Brahman.
Okay.
And then in the Buddhist Pali Canon, they use the term Dithi, or sometimes Dichyati. That signifies a sort of comprehensive metaphysical viewpoint, a whole philosophical outlook. And if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, you find Adhyatmedya, again, the science of the self, the inner being.
Interesting how the self keeps coming up.
It really does.
Yeah.
And what's cool about the Gita is how it connects this self-knowledge with dialectic, with reasoned argument and inquiry. It suggests a very early recognition that you need both inner exploration and logical thinking to get at ultimate truths.
That blend seems important.
Definitely. And even later, the Vaiseshika Sutra, around the 1st century AD, introduces Siddhadarsana. That's kind of like a perfected vision or insight, maybe gained through merit or deep understanding. Prasatada, a later commentator, interpreted this as a kind of direct perception, maybe through super refined senses or powerful inference, or even some kind of innate intuition we all have.
Wow. So it really seems like across cultures, across time, this fundamental human itch to understand what's beyond the immediate, the physical, just keeps showing up. Different words, different frameworks, but the same basic quest. Okay, so we've got a feel for the what and where. Let's dive into the core ideas. When philosophers talk about being with a capital B in metaphysics, what exactly are they getting at?
Yeah, this is absolutely central. Our sources draw this really fundamental distinction between, well, the kinds of beings we encounter. You've got finite things, rocks, trees, objects, and finite persons. That's us, conscious individuals.
Okay, things and persons. What's the key difference metaphysically?
It boils down to their relationship with being itself. Things, objects, they participate in being based on their essence, their specific nature, what they are. They kind of strive for their own fullness within their limits,
Yeah.
but they don't, maybe they can't, distinguish being as such from their own essence. They remain, as one source puts it, sort of blank to themselves and the bigger picture.
So a rock just is. It has being, it exists, but it doesn't sit around contemplating its existence.
Precisely. It doesn't reflect on it. Now, persons, we also participate in being through our essence, what makes you, you, or me, me. But crucially, in our very consciousness and our ability to think and reflect, we can distinguish being from our essence. We can think about existence itself. And in doing that, the sources suggest we attain to being itself in a really unique way. There's an essential connection between person and being.
An essential connection.
Yeah, think of it like this. Being is maybe alienated or kind of distanced in mere things, but it finds a sort of home in persons through our capacity for reflection and understanding. So really grasping this relationship is key to understanding the metaphysical structure of being human.
Okay, that makes sense. So if a person, this experiencing agent, has this special link to being, how is that person structured? What are the metaphysical building blocks, so to speak?
Well, there's this elegant principle. As the operation is, so the agent is.
Mm-hmm.
Our conscious experience has two sides, right? There's the act of doing or being, philosophers call this exercise. And then there's what is being done or what kind of being we are, that's determination.
Okay, act and content, sort of.
Exactly. So the agent, the person, is seen as composed of two fundamental principles mirroring this. Being itself, the act of existence, often called essence, and essence, or essentia, which is what we are, our basic nature.
Being in essence.
Right. And then essence itself can be broken down further. You've got substance, the underlying thing that persists, and accidents, the changing qualities or characteristics of that substance.
Like the color of my shirt is an accident, but I'm the substance.
Roughly, yeah. And even substance gets broken down further into prime matter, which is like pure potentiality, raw stuff, and substantial form, the principle that give that potentiality actual shape and definition.
Wow, okay. So it's like layers, peeling back the onion from the fundamental act of existing right down to potentiality itself. And our consciousness lets us bridge these layers, connect back to that fundamental being.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And the sources really emphasize that being isn't just some, dusty philosophical term. It's presented as the real objective of our pure desire to know. That deep-seated human curiosity, that drive to understand that's behind all our judgments, all our questions.
That feeling that there's always more to know.
Exactly. It's seen as an unrestricted notion, something basic, universal, spontaneously working away in all of us, even before we consciously make judgments about stuff. Think about it. Why do we want to know anything? Ultimately, these philosophers argue it's rooted in a desire to know being itself, the very foundation of everything.
That resonates every time I ask why. It feels like I'm digging towards something more fundamental than just the surface answer.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And being, in this view, it constitutes all the levels of our knowing, from raw sensory experience through intellectual understanding right up to our reasoned judgments. Knowing, at its absolute core, is knowing being. Even though, of course, what we actually know is never just pure undifferentiated being. It's always being manifesting in some specific, limited way.
Right, like knowing this specific thing exists.
Exactly. And furthermore, being is seen as the very core of meaning itself. It underpins, it penetrates, it constitutes everything we can know or think about all cognitional content. The meaning of any particular judgment, say the sky is blue, isn't just isolated. It gets its full significance from its place within this bigger universal intention towards being.
So when we find something meaningful, it's because it taps into this underlying reality of being, even subconsciously.
That's the idea, precisely.
Yeah.
Now, here's a really key point about how we access being. Our knowledge of it is conditioned by what's called pre-apprehension.
Pre-apprehension?
Yeah, basically our active engagement with the physical world around us. We start our journey to understanding with concrete, material things. That's our entry point. Even when we try to think about immaterial things like justice or numbers, we often do it by drawing analogies to material things, right? We think of them in ways that still reference some kind of appearance, some way of being present to us.
So our senses, our interaction with the physical world, are the necessary starting point for grasping being, even the non-physical aspects.
Yes, experience provides the initial data, the framework. But, and this is crucial, it's through the uniquely human act of questioning that we become aware of the ontological difference.
Ontological difference.
That's the fundamental distinction between being itself, with a capital B, and all the individual beings, lowercase b, that participate in being. Questioning really brings this to light. It's presented as this final, irreducible act. You can't really question questioning itself without just asking another question. Right?
Yeah, true.
So this inherent, inescapable need to question is what ultimately drives us to the big metaphysical question.
Okay.
What is being? And in the very act of asking, being sort of presents itself as the target of our search, but it also withdraws, remaining partly mysterious, something we can never fully pin down. This dynamic, this constant questioning is what makes humans, as one philosopher put it, the being of the question.
The being of the question. I like that. It really captures that restless human intellect, doesn't it? So this questioning process reveals something crucial about being itself.
Absolutely. It reveals the unconditioned absolute being as the very horizon of all our inquiry. It's something we implicitly assume is there every single time we ask a question. We can't even formulate a question properly without already assuming there's some reality to be known, right? Some ground your question is aiming at.
Makes sense.
And this horizon of being, it has to be unlimited for it to even conceive of absolute knowledge, of a complete understanding. The depth of being connects to its universal reach. And furthermore, the idea is that every contingent being that's anything that exists but could conceivably not exist, like you or me or this table, requires a ground, a sufficient reason for its existence. And ultimately, that ground, that sufficient reason, is found in the necessity of being itself, posited by an efficient cause, which fundamentally is being itself.
Okay, wow, that's a lot packed into being. So we've explored being. Now let's pivot to its partner concept, essence. How does essence relate to being in this picture?
Right, essence. In relation to being, essence is seen as absolutely prior in the first cause, the ultimate source of everything. In that ultimate source, essences are like the blueprints, the ground of individual natures, defining what each thing potentially is. Essence functions as formal causality. It's a potency, a capacity for real existence that distinguishes something from just nothing.
So it's the what it isness.
Exactly. It's what determines the actual act of existence, limiting it to specific forms and characteristics, like the essence of treeness is what makes something a tree and not, say, a squirrel.
Okay, so essence defines the potential, the blueprint.
Precisely. And a key point, essence doesn't need prior actuality to determine being. The blueprint for a tree exists as a possibility even before any specific tree grows. A being's actual existence, its esse, is said to flow from its essence through this formal causality, but it still needs an efficient cause, ultimately being itself, to become actual, to pop into reality.
Right, the blueprint needs a builder.
Kind of, yeah. Essence is also seen as one of the two fundamental annotative principles, the basic building blocks along with being. Together, they constitute all finite beings. We grasp sensible things, things we can perceive simultaneously in their essence, apprehending what they are, and in their being, judging that they are. In the first cause, being is pure, unlimited nature. But in finite things, being exists as act, and essence is the principle of limitation shaping that act. So when we ask what is it, we're asking about its essence. And that question automatically implies determined limits, the boundaries of its being, and what makes it distinct from other things.
Okay, let me try to summarize that. Being is the fundamental isness, the act of existing, and essence is the what it isness that shapes, defines, and limits that being in actual, individual, finite things.
That's a really good summary. Exactly.
Great. Now, let's swing back eastward again. How did early Indian thought, specifically the Vaiseshika school, categorize reality? You mentioned they had these padarthas.
Yes, the Vaiseshika school. They developed this really detailed, systematic approach using categories called padartha.
Padartha. What does that mean exactly?
It translates roughly as category, or maybe the meaning of a word or object. Pasastapada, who was a key commentator, Defined it basically as anything that is knowable, anything we can validly understand, or anything we can give a name to. The Naya-Visicha school they eventually merged had this very realistic view of the world. They believed the objects we perceive are real things out there, and we know them through our senses, both external, like sight and touch, and the internal sense, which they consider the mind.
Okay, a realistic approach.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And Canada, the founder, initially laid out 6 fundamental padarthas, 6 categories to cover everything. A 7th, non-existence, was added later.
6. Then 7 categories for everything. That sounds incredibly ambitious. What were they?
Canada's original 6 were substance or dravya, quality or guna, action, karma, generality, samanya, particularity, vishesha, and inherent samavaya. Then later they added non-existence, apava. And importantly, these weren't just seen as logical boxes or ways of thinking. They were considered real ontological entities, actual aspects of reality itself.
So like non-existence was considered a real thing.
In their view, yes. If you smash a pot, the non-existence of that pot now was seen as a real, distinct state or entity, not just the absence of the pot.
Huh. Okay, let's start with the first one, maybe the most basic. Substance, or dravya. What do they mean by that?
Substance, for Vaiseshika, is the underlying foundation, the substratum where actions and qualities reside. It's the basic material cause that persists through changes. They argued a substance could only be truly destroyed if its own fundamental nature, its substratum, was destroyed, not just by changing its qualities. Prasapada saw substance as the main category, the one everything else depends on. Remember our white cloth example?
Yeah.
In this system, the cloth is the substance, the fundamental thing. The whiteness is a quality that inheres in the substance, but it's distinct from it. They even discuss when qualities start inhering, suggesting it happens from the second moment the substance exists, through this intimate union called samavaya sambandha.
So the substance exists first, then qualities stick to it.
That's the basic idea. And they identified 9 fundamental substances.
9. Okay, what are they?
Earth, water, fire, air, ether, which is like space or akasha, then time, space meaning direction, dik spirit or soul, the atman, and mind manas.
Wow, that includes physical elements, but also mind and soul.
Exactly. It's a pluralistic system, multiple real substances, and realistic, but definitely not purely materialistic because it includes soul and mind. The first 5 were the physical elements, each with unique qualities like smell belonging only to earth. They also distinguish between eternal aspects, the atoms of the first 4, plus ether, time, space, are eternal and non-eternal compounded forms. And importantly, they believed in many individual souls, atmina, plus one supreme soul, and saw the mind manas as an internal sense organ for inner experience.
Okay, 9 substances gives a very structured picture. What about the other categories they identified? Quality, action, etc.
Right, briefly, quality, guna, inheres in substance. They listed 24 types, things like color, taste, smell, touch, number, size, but also pleasure, pain, knowledge, effort.
24 qualities.
Yeah, quite specific. Action, karma, is movement residing in a substance. 5 basic types: moving up, down, contracting, expanding, in general locomotion. Generality, samanya, is a universal property shared by many things, like cowness existing in all cows. They distinguish between higher and lower universals too. Particularity, vishesha, is the opposite. It's the unique ultimate differentiator of eternal substances, like individual atoms or souls. Infinite number of these, each and only one thing.
Ah, so that's what makes one atom different from another identical one.
That's the idea of vishesha, yeah. Then in anyat samavaya is that special eternal glue-like relation between things that are inseparable but distinct like a whole in its parts, or quality in the substance it's in. And finally, non-existence apava considered a real negation. They had types like prior non-existence, the pot before it was made, posterior non-existence, the pot after it's smashed, mutual non-existence, the pot is not the cloth, and absolute non-existence like horns on a rabbit.
It's incredibly detailed, a whole system for mapping reality. Okay, stepping back a bit, are there fundamental principles that guide metaphysical thinking more broadly, across both West and East?
Yes, definitely. In the West, you often hear about several key ones. First, the principle of distinction. Every being is distinct in some way. Seems obvious, maybe, but it's fundamental for any thought or language. You have to distinguish things to talk about them.
Right, gotta tell A from B.
Exactly. Then you have the really core logical ones, the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of excluded middle. Non-contradiction says something can't be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. It reflects the basic nature of being versus non-being. A thing can't be both entirely blue and entirely not blue, simultaneously in the same way.
The bedrock of logic, really.
It is.
Hmm.
An excluded middle follows from that. For any clear proposition, either it's true or the negation is true. There's no third option, no middle ground between being and non-being.
Okay. Those seem foundational to how we reason.
They are, but the claim is they also reflect something fundamental about reality itself. Then there's the principle of causality. Whatever happens, whatever comes to be, must have a cause. Something must bring it about. You see echoes of this in Eastern ideas like dependence arising too.
Everything's connected, nothing pops out of nowhere.
That's the idea. Then the principle of knowledge. The undeniable fact that we know things, that basic I know that I know awareness. In some Indian traditions, especially around language, you find the principle of meaning, or sphota. The idea that a word or phrase is a single, meaningful, eternal symbol that sounds just reveal. There's also a principle of negation. Often, thought starts by noticing what something isn't, especially when we hit limits or obstacles. And balancing that, the principle of assertion or affirmation. Every negation implies some underlying affirmation. Saying what something isn't often points toward what it is or the context it exists in.
So even saying no affirms something in the background. Interesting. Now, going back to the Nyaya Vaiseshika school with their detailed categories, did they have specific principles about causality, for instance?
Yes, absolutely. Their theory of causation is really distinctive. It's called asatkaryavada, or sometimes arambhavada. It's built on this idea of dharma dharmipeda, the absolute difference between a substance, dharmi, and its properties, dharmaya, and therefore between a cause and its effect.
Absolute difference. How so?
They argue that the effect is a completely new creation. It didn't exist, even potentially, within the cause before it was made. The effect, karya kadenaya, was non-existent, asat, before its production. Udayana, a later philosopher in this tradition, defined a cause very carefully. And it has to be an invariable and unconditional antecedent of the effect.
Invariable and unconditional.
Yeah, meaning it must come before the effect, the antecedents. It must always be followed by the effect invariability, and it can't depend on some other condition to work, unconditionality. And crucially, they believe the cause does not transmit its own essence to the effect. The effect arises in the cause and resides in it through that inherence relation, samavaya, but they remain distinct entities.
So when a potter makes a pot from clay, the pot is a totally new thing, not just rearranged clay.
Exactly. The pot inheres in the clay particles, but it's a new entity, a new beginning, aramba. The clay is the material cause. The potter's actions are efficient causes, but the pot itself is a distinct existent that wasn't there before.
That's quite different from, say, thinking the potential pot was already in the clay somehow.
Very different. It emphasizes genuine novelty in the effect.
Okay. Let's shift now to one of those really big, persistent philosophical puzzles you mentioned earlier, the problem of the one and the many. How do we make sense of the unity we sometimes perceive or assume in reality, alongside the obvious multiplicity of everything around us?
Ah, yes, the perennial question. It's absolutely central, this puzzle of how the underlying one relates to the diverse many. It pops up everywhere, east and west, from the very earliest Greek thinkers like Heraclitus and Parmenides, right through all the schools in India.
Heraclitus seeing constant change, the many, as fundamental, and Parmenides arguing for one unchanging being. Talk about opposite ends of the spectrum.
Exactly. They really set the stage for so much Western debate. Heraclitus with his can't step in the same river twice, emphasizing flux, multiplicity. Parmenides arguing that true reality must be one, unchanging, indivisible, and that all the change and variety we see is just illusion.
And in India?
A huge spectrum, too. You see it debated in the Vedas, in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, debates about whether there's one soul or many, one ultimate reality like Brahman, or fundamental plurality, the nature of universals versus particulars. Even things like Vedic henotheism, focusing worship on one god at a time while acknowledging others, kind of reflects this tension, doesn't it? Trying to find unity within multiplicity.
It really does seem universal. So how do the metaphysical frameworks we've been discussing tackle this one-many problem?
Well, one approach highlighted in our sources uses the idea of one action with many elements. Think about exercising. It's the single unified activity, right? But it involves tons of different muscles, nerves, movements, all working together.
Okay, one action, many parts.
Right. And similarly, a finite being, especially a person, is presented as one in many. You're one individual, but composed of multiple principles. Being and essence, substance and accidents, prime matter and substantial form, all integrated into a single entity. And being itself, remember, is seen as immanent, present within all finite beings. But it's not there as pure, unqualified being. It's always being as received and limited by the specific essence of that particular being.
So essence limits the one being into many specific beings.
Precisely. Essence acts as the principle of limitation, modifying the unlimited potential of being into a concrete individual being. But the key insight is that being allows itself to be modified, to be participated in. Finite beings get their reality from this participation in unlimited being.
So the one being isn't separate but manifests in and through the many beings via limitation and participation.
Exactly. There's a priority of being. The mode is a mode of being, but it needs essence to be this specific mode. And this idea of unlimited being underlying everything might point towards, an absolutely transcendent one, an absolute ground that is the source of all the many beings. So being is the principle of unlimitation, perfection, what makes things real. Essence is the principle of limitation, determination, what gives things their specific wetness, which involves a kind of relative negation of being's full potential.
It's like being is the infinite canvas, and essence draws the specific picture on it.
That's a nice analogy.
Yeah.
And you see this pattern repeated at other levels too. Think substance and accident.
Right, the orange example.
Exactly. The substance, the orange itself, is the relatively permanent one that underlies the many changing accidents, its color, texture, taste as it ripens. One substance, many qualities. Or think prime matter and substantial form. Matter is the underlying principle of potentiality, the one potential stuff. Form is the determining principle that gives it specific actuality, organizing it into the many kinds of bodies. Their union creates one specific thing.
So it's not really about choosing between one and many, but seeing how unity and multiplicity are constantly interwoven at different levels of reality.
That seems to be the direct of these metaphysical accounts point, yes. Understanding that dynamic interplay.
Okay. Now, this being the deep dive, we should definitely touch on how all this often ancient metaphysical thinking relates to, well, modern science. Does it connect?
That's a really important question, and yes, our sources briefly touch on it. Modern physics, especially things like quantum mechanics and relativity, has profoundly shaken up our everyday common sense view of matter and reality, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Things get weird at the quantum level. Wave-particle duality, uncertainty.
Exactly. Quantum mechanics shows us a fundamental reality that seems inherently probabilistic, indeterminate, and relativity, both special and general, shows that basic things like mass, length, motion, even time, aren't absolute. They're relative to the observer's frame of reference.
So the solid, predictable world we thought we lived in dissolves into something much stranger and more relative at the extremes.
Pretty much. And here's where some see a potential resonance with classical metaphysics. Remember prime matter as the principle of pure potentiality or indetermination, and substantial form as the principle of determination or actuality.
Yes.
Well, some thinkers see that ancient framework as potentially offering a philosophical lens, a way to understand or at least conceptualize these bizarre findings. The indeterminacy at the quantum level, particles in multiple states at once, could that reflect prime matter's potentiality? The relativity of properties. Could that relate to how form structures that potentiality depending on context or interaction?
That's fascinating. The idea that millennia-old concepts might provide a way to frame, maybe even make sense of, cutting-edge science.
It's a provocative thought, certainly. Not that ancient philosophers predicted quantum mechanics, obviously, but that their fundamental categories of potentiality and actuality might still have relevance for understanding a reality that turned out to be much less fixed and determinate than we once thought.
Okay, that leads us towards the ultimate questions, being the absolute ultimate reality. Where does metaphysical inquiry take us when we push it that far?
Well, the concept of the absolute often emerges as the kind of logical endpoint, or at least the horizon, of metaphysical seeking. For theists, this absolute is often, though cautiously, identified with God. And this absolute, or God, is typically characterized as, well, unlimited existence, perfect consciousness, unalloyed bliss. You see echoes in the Indian concept of Satchidananda, being consciousness bliss.
Being consciousness bliss.
And significantly, the human response to perceiving this ultimate reality, this fundamental gift of existence, is often described as being rooted in love.
So it's not just an intellectual endpoint, but something that evokes a profound, personal, even emotional or spiritual response.
That seems crucial, yes. The sources hint at a convergence here between insights from Eastern and Western metaphysics and also the experiences reported by mystics across traditions. They often speak of encountering the wholly other, something both awesome and fascinating, the mysterium fascinans leading perhaps to grace and ultimately a sense of union or deep connection.
A meeting with reality itself.
Perhaps.
Huh.
And the response to being, to this ultimate reality, is often seen as having three interconnected dimensions. First, an enlightened understanding, maybe jnana in India or faith in the West. Second, a deep love or devotion, bhakti, or simply love. And third, a commitment to acting rightly in the world, karma or hope. These aren't separate but intertwined aspects of relating to the ultimate.
Understanding, loving, acting.
Exactly. And there's even a suggestion that being itself might be fundamentally self-giving, that its nature might be akin to pure love, agape, which implies a kind of reciprocal relationship, a call for us to give back, to live in harmony and peace. This idea, sometimes called an agapeic ontology, is even linked tentatively to the path from violence towards peace, perhaps reflected implicitly in the lives and philosophies of people like Gandhi or Mother Teresa.
Wow. So metaphysics, pushed to its limit, doesn't just describe reality. It might actually guide us on how to live ethically and spiritually within that reality.
That's a very powerful and compelling conclusion one could draw, yes.
Yeah.
It suggests metaphysics provides not just a map of existence, but perhaps also points towards a way of being within it, considering not just what is, but how we should relate to it.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible depth dive, seriously deep. We've journeyed from the origins of metaphysics in Greece and India, unpacked core ideas like being and essence, wrestled with that persistent one in many puzzle.
Tackled Vaseshika categories.
Right. Glimpsed connections to modern science and ended up contemplating the absolute and even love as fundamental aspects of reality. It really hammers home that enduring human drive, doesn't it, to grapple with these ultimate questions about existence.
It certainly does.
And maybe one of the biggest takeaways for me is seeing how unity and multiplicity aren't necessarily opposites to be resolved, but maybe a fundamental dynamic, an interplay that shapes reality at every level, from physics to metaphysics to our own lives. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How does your own picture of reality, your own sense of yourself and the world resonate or maybe clash with some of these incredibly diverse and profound perspectives we've explored today? Something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.